Bien, cambiamos un poco de tema. Durante la pandemia aprendimos mucho.
Sí.
Por ejemplo, mucho de ciencia con todo el tema de las vacunas, mucho de cómo somos capaces los seres humanos de sobreponernos a las dificultades cuando estamos todos unidos. Y sin duda, y esto nos llegó a todos, algo que aprendimos también fue que podemos llevar gran parte de nuestra vida, Macarena, online. Una de estas aristas fue el aprendizaje también y la formación en línea. Justamente para hablar de esto, hoy nos acompaña desde el otro lado del planeta Melissa Bond. Ella es Lecturer of Digital Technology Education, University of South Australia. De hecho, Melissa, te damos la bienvenida y muchas gracias por participar junto a nosotros.
Hi there, thank you so much for watching my presentation today. My name is Dr. Melissa Bond and I'm from the University of South Australia and University College London. And I'm here today to present my talk on global emergency remote teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic, thoughts and findings of online learning during COVID. And I'd like to thank very much the Universidad Del Desarrollo and the Fundación Telefónica Movistar for inviting me to present at the Conecta Educar conference. So a little bit about me to begin with. As I said, I am from the University of South Australia. I just moved back to Australia very recently in December, and I am a lecturer in digital technology education. I'm also an EPI Reviewer Support Officer for University College London for the EPI Centre, and EPI Reviewer is an evidence synthesis software. So I provide methodological support and hints and tips and create some videos for them as well. In terms of my research background, I have done quite a bit of research, synthesizing primary research, so producing systematic reviews and mapping reviews. Aside from looking at teaching and learning in K-12 and higher education during the COVID pandemic, I've also looked at things like artificial intelligence in education. I've looked at student engagement and educational technology, as well as, in particular, the flipped learning approach, which links quite strongly to some of these emergency remote teaching practices that we've had to employ during the pandemic. So I'd like to start off this talk, first of all, with a review that we undertook, looking at emergency remote teaching in higher education. And in particular, this was focusing on research that was undertaken globally during that first online semester where we all had to make that shift to emergency remote education. And the research questions for this particular piece of work were: where, when, and by whom was the research on teaching and learning in higher ed during the pandemic, where it had been published? When, by whom? So, you know, who were the people? Where were the people? Then, what are the characteristics, methods, and topics studied in this research? And what technology was used during emergency remote education in higher education? Now, before I go into any of the method or the results of this particular piece of work, I think it's really important to frame my presentation today by looking at, first of all, how we approached this research. And this is a bioecological student engagement framework that I adapted from Bronfenbrenner and colleagues, as well as a whole range of literature on student engagement, and in particular looking at how technology fits within the dynamics of learning and teaching in the modern sort of age. So here we see the student-centered, right in the center, nested, if you will, within these interconnected layers. So here we have the student within the microsystem, surrounded by things that influence them within that teaching and learning microsystem. So things like technology or the curriculum, their peers, the institution, family, and teachers. This is then surrounded by and influences and is influenced by their socioeconomic background of that particular student. Around that is the exosystem. So these are things that are slightly external to the student. So for example, things like institutional policies, the national curriculum, social services, any employment that they're involved in, any kind of influences coming from extended family, and so on and so forth, the wider community. And then around that is the macro system. And those are things like, a country's political and social environment, a nation's policies, the rate of digitalization within that particular context, and all of those wider contextual factors that really influence teaching and learning, but at a very sort of macro level. So this is how we approached our both of the reviews that I'm going to talk about today, and how I approach a lot of the research that I do, with that deep understanding of the multiple and interconnected contextual influences on teaching and learning. So this particular systematic review, we actually conducted it as a mapping review with the aim of having it as a living review so that it could be an ongoing resource for people who are looking for research around emergency remote education during the pandemic. It is publicly available, freely accessible, and I think we've got the links to it at the end of the presentation. But if you'd like to know more, then please do contact me. But we did this review using the evidence synthesis software that I mentioned already, EpiReviewer. And basically, it just keeps all of your data and all of your information and processes in the one place. So we searched through quite a number of different databases. We searched ERIC, Web of Science, Scopus, PsycInfo, Google Scholar, the Microsoft Academic Graph, ProQuest, EBSCOhost, and the COVID-19 Living Map, which was co-produced through the Epicenter with a number of other colleagues, and is also a freely accessible database of research that happened during the pandemic, or is happening, should I say. So the inclusion criteria, what we were really focused on in this review was that it would be higher education focused. The studies could be in English, Spanish, or German, and that was able to happen because we had a multilingual research team. The studies needed to be focused on teaching and learning. They needed to be primary empirical research, and they really needed to focus on students, educators, or administrators as the unit of analysis. So after all of the systematic review steps of searching, screening on title and abstract, screening on full text, and quality appraisal, we ended up with 282 studies that we then synthesized the results of. In terms of where the participants were located for this particular review, we actually found that the slight majority was based in Asia, followed very closely by Europe. And I think that really reflects the ferocity of the pandemic and the way that it spread. Because as we know, Asia and Europe they were sort of hot zones right from the very beginning. And that was followed by North America, the Middle East, South America, Africa, and Oceania. And of course, Oceania having slightly less in terms of numbers and growth with the pandemic. The research in this review we found was primarily focused on students and heavily focused on students, and particularly undergraduate students. And this actually follows other reviews that we've done looking at educational technology and student engagement, that there really is very little research comparatively on postgraduate students. There were also not a lot of studies, so almost a third of studies focused on the educators as the participants in this research. And those that did were generally looking at the perceptions of educators of the teaching learning process. There were relatively few smaller samples, which meant that they had less than 25 participants, which only represented just over 16% of the research in this review. And it was certainly a lot less than we found in a similar review that looked at school, so K-12. Like with other reviews that we found, the research was predominantly focused on health and welfare students, followed by natural science, maths, and statistics. In terms of the focus of this research, there was a heavy focus on student perceptions of online learning or emergency remote education, followed by the impact of that shift to online learning, and then much lower, again, as I said, teacher perceptions of emergency remote education. The top 3 tools that we found that were used within this research was heavily focused on synchronous collaboration tools, so things like video conferencing tools, followed by learning management systems and multimodal production tools. And that includes videos that are recorded by instructors that are then uploaded to an LMS, or YouTube videos that have been recorded by someone else and are, available on YouTube or some other video streaming platform. In terms of the approach of the research that was undertaken, we found a heavy focus on quantitative research, and in particular, a heavy focus on self-report, self-designed sort of questionnaires that were fit for purpose, and that did not necessarily rely on previously validated instruments. So I like to call it, to say that there was sort of emergency remote research that was happening during the pandemic. And as a result, then, these instruments were being designed that were fit for purpose in that emergency remote situation. As with other, and I should mention, as with other reviews, we found a lot less qualitative research. So even though there were a lot of research looking at perceptions and how students experienced this pandemic, there weren't a lot of studies that actually went into depth and really got that deep understanding, the rich data from the students. In terms of the gaps in the research, the blind spots, if you will, we found that there was a lot less research looking at issues of ethics in terms of online learning or online assessment or, tracking software. We found a lot less research looking at vulnerable groups, such as students with special educational needs and disabilities. We also found that, and this is in line again with other reviews that we've done, there is a great need for far more detail in study design being reported in empirical research. There were a lot of studies that didn't mention how the technology was used at all in the learning situation. And that's really important, as well as greater detail in the context of where the study was being conducted. You can't always assume, for example, that people know or understand your context. So it's very important that you include that information if you're reporting some research that you've done. We found a lot less research than we expected that looked at data analytics, assessment tools, and social networking tools. And this was particularly surprising given the freely accessible nature of a lot of social networking tools, and the fact that so many students still, there is still this digital divide, even in high-income countries. So it's really important that institutions and educators consider, the student context and the access that students have to these digital tools that we're asking them to use. As I already mentioned, postgraduate students were far less researched than undergraduate students, and I think that really does represent an area for further investigation. And there was an unbalanced distribution of countries, authors and participants, for both authors and participants, should I say. And again, that could be due to our search strategy. Certainly the fact that we only included English, Spanish and German language articles, and that perhaps there were many other studies that were published in native languages that we weren't able to include because of our own linguistic shortcomings. But so there are certainly some limitations to the review, but interesting nonetheless. Okay, now I'd like to talk about a review that we did looking purely at secondary school students during the pandemic. Very similar review to the first one we conducted looking at higher education, but in this one we looked at a few other areas. So our research questions included, in what ways did emergency remote education affect the motivation and engagement of secondary students? What emerging online assessment practices were found? Were there any new approaches to peer collaboration? And what did that suggest? We looked at how online learning in schools affected parent engagement, as well as looking at what kinds of emerging practices have been undertaken that perhaps could be continued to be implemented going forwards. So again, this was a systematic review. This was a full systematic review, which included quality appraisal and synthesis. And we really focused on secondary school only. And this meant that any studies that reported a combination of primary and secondary student data, we actually chose to exclude. Purely because of the difference in context, the difference in the experiences of primary school students as opposed to secondary school students. We do anticipate undertaking one for primary school years in the future, but for this one we focused on secondary only. And we also focused on English language only research because of our time constraints and because of the language ability of the research team. Again, we were only including primary empirical research that included online or blended learning approaches and was really focused on that microsystem level. So after all of those steps of systematic reviews, we ended up with 81 studies to include for synthesis. In this particular review, we chose to extract data looking at the income level of countries as according to the World Bank. And so here we found that there was actually more studies that were conducted in Asia as opposed to Europe. You know, with the higher education, it was pretty much bang on the same number of studies from Asia and Europe. But here there were certainly a lot more studies that included participants from Asia. And there were actually less studies that focused that included participants from South and Central America as opposed to the higher education context. We found that 54% of studies were undertaken in high-income countries, but we did have quite a reasonable representation from low and lower middle-income countries as well. In terms of the engagement indicators that appeared in the results of these studies, we found that students and teachers reported a heightened self-regulation, which was quite a lot higher in terms of its frequency appearing within these studies as opposed to the other indicators of engagement, which were understanding, like a greater understanding of topics or the tasks that they were required to do, enjoyment, positive study habits, which relates to a heightened self-regulation, and a sense of well-being. Teachers reported that some students reported that some of the students were more motivated to learn and to complete schoolwork. And this actually applied to, in particular, some students who had a lot of truancy in the past, who perhaps wouldn't necessarily have attended school face-to-face, but who actually they were able to attend the online lessons and to participate a lot more. It also related to students who perhaps were normally quite reserved or quiet in the classroom. And some of these students found that the online ways of teaching and learning actually gave them a little bit more courage and perhaps a little bit more a little bit more freedom to be able to undertake these tasks and to speak up than they would normally in a face-to-face situation. In terms of disengagement, how the emergency remote education affected student disengagement, we found a very high percentage of social isolation, of social disengagement, which, given the lockdown pandemic situation, is probably completely understandable. That was followed by absence from live lessons, students feeling confused, not understanding task instructions, feeling overwhelmed, and a general dislike of the approach. Students felt not just a physical distance from their peers or their teacher, they also felt an emotional distance as well. And it was interesting that there were more instances of behavioural disengagement in studies from higher income countries as opposed to lower middle income countries. And that could be partly due to the fact that high income countries were more often associated with the use of video conferencing software, whereas lower middle income countries didn't have as much access to that kind of way of teaching and learning. They used more text-based tools. And we found an association between research where they used those video conferencing or synchronous collaboration tools and disengagement. So that could explain some of that difference. We also found that the sheer fact for both teachers and students of having to learn to use these new tools, as well as learning how to learn online, was really quite overwhelming, alongside the extra life load that was involved. Suddenly having to cope with the pandemic, perhaps having to cope with more caregiving responsibilities in the home if they had younger siblings, for example, or if they were teachers, having to look after their own young children as well. If we compare the engagement indicators that we found in this review to the flipped learning review that I did before the pandemic, and I will just say you can't really compare these like for like because they're completely different situations, completely different research, but it is still interesting to look at the difference. We see that some of the indicators are the same in the way that engagement manifested, but that the percentages were a lot lower in the pandemic research. If we look at the disengagement indicators though, aside from obviously that large percentage of students that found that experienced social isolation, we found very similar rates of percentage in terms of the disengagement indicators. So for example, there's still confusion and dislike and frustration sitting around the 15-14% mark. In terms of technology that was used, certainly as with the higher education review, we were really quite surprised at the lack of research reporting a use of data analytics tools, assessment tools, and social networking tools. Given the online nature of the teaching and learning during the pandemic for a lot of people, we really did expect to see more exploration and explanation of how assessment tools were being used online, but we didn't find that, which was really quite interesting. Okay, in terms of what was found engaging though, where assessment tools were reported, quizzes were found particularly engaging. So once students had watched, for example, some videos, an educator video where they explained some concepts, having a quiz afterwards, as well as even a quiz beforehand to assess, understanding of concepts prior to a video, was found really quite engaging. Learning management systems that have collaborative tools were also found particularly engaging. And so too were breakout rooms that had chat facility to really enable that peer interaction and teaching to happen. Students really missed that peer-to-peer engagement and opportunities to interact with their peers. So where social time was included at the beginning and at the end of an online lesson, 5 minutes for students to just shoot the breeze, talk about their lives and what was going on, how they were feeling, or whatever they really wanted to talk about with their peers, was found really beneficial by students. We also found more indicators of engagement in research where teachers made the videos themselves. And I should reiterate that students don't mind if you make a mistake in a video. They don't mind how you sound in a video. Just keep going. They're used to hearing you talk, and being on a video makes no difference. So keep going. Doesn't matter if you make a mistake. But we did find that where educators used teacher-made videos alongside videos that were made by others, so perhaps other educators or YouTube videos or what have you, where they were both available in a unit of work, that was actually found to be slightly more engaging than just one or the other. Particular challenges during the pandemic. Well, the lack of student attendance in live lessons was really problematic for some educators. As I mentioned, the decreased opportunities for interaction with peers was a real challenge, and led to further social disengagement, social isolation. Students found unexpected changes to the school day a real issue, and they, so for example, if they expected to have lessons at a certain time in the day, if there was to be a sudden change or in that structure, that was really confusing and overwhelming for some, or if they expected to be able to choose how their day would unfold and then all of a sudden they had to be at a specific place at a specific time, that was also a little confusing. Excuse me. There were, of course, fewer opportunities to ask questions, not just of the teacher, but also of peers. And students also found that written explanations were sometimes really unclear. Overwhelming amounts of work for some students was a particular challenge, as well as distractions in the home. Where, for example, there might be younger siblings or other people in the house trying to use multiple, the same device between multiple members of the family was also a real challenge. So what does this mean for practice? Well, if we use the bioecological framework to go through this, it's really important that there is a greater awareness of an ongoing digital divide by the governments at the greater national level and even and at a local state level as well. And this is the case even for high income countries, that there still exists a great divide between some populations. And I think this is really important also, that government policies should start to recognise more the amount of time that it takes to create these resources, and that perhaps a slight reduction in contact time for teachers in order to be able to make these resources. And to be able to undertake professional development to improve their understanding of blended and online approaches is really important. And then at the institutional level, then there needs to be greater support for teachers, and that includes an increase in funding for teachers to be able to conduct professional development. There could be, for example, joint teacher-parent workshops, which would then, just help build that understanding that, we're all in this together, and would help parents to learn the skills that they need to be able to support their children in any online learning. And it's really important also to consider the knowledge and skills that students bring from primary schools up to high schools, especially if you've got feeder schools you've got students coming from multiple different primary schools into the one secondary school. Well, you may have students who have never really been exposed to online learning at all before, mixed in with students that have very high digital skills. And that's something that really needs to be considered. In terms of considering student socioeconomic background, it's really important that institutions, whether they are K-12 or higher education, that you conduct a needs analysis, so that you find out what kinds of hardware that students have access to. Do they have a laptop? Do they only have a mobile phone? Does that mobile phone have internet connection or not? It's really important that not just at the individual classroom level or the faculty level, but also at the institutional level, that you have some kind of bird's eye view of what resources your students have access to. And if it's needed, to put in some kind of loan equipment in place for students to be able to access, so that they are able to continue their education no matter what the circumstance. And, to that end, ensuring that learning resources are available via multiple methods of representation, multiple methods of being able to access them as well. So looking at that microsystem, I already mentioned the really vital importance of teacher professional development, but also that teachers are encouraged to undertake their own practitioner research at any level of education. Also found particularly engaging was where teachers would do what's called flipped feedback, where they would record their feedback to a student's assignment, either just recording the audio or recording it via video, just like I'm doing now. And that just allows the student to understand a little bit more about perhaps what you're trying to get at when you're providing feedback to them. And it also gives just a little bit more personal link as well. In terms of technology, as I've mentioned, it's important that students have access to collaborative technologies to be able to have that peer-to-peer opportunity to interact, perhaps also peer assessment, which was found quite engaging. And that you record your own videos where possible. Doesn't need to be fancy equipment, just need to be able to see you, or at the very least to be able to hear your voice. It's important though that those videos are aligned to the curriculum and that videos aren't just thrown into a unit of work just because. It really does need to align to learning outcomes. If possible, embedding quizzes at the beginning and at the end of videos or within units of work is really has really been found not only engaging but to improve learning outcomes. And where possible, of course, we should always differentiate for the different levels of student ability in our classes. Where family are involved, and this is probably more for your K-12 level rather than higher education, consider offering professional development to families in blended and online learning. Encourage them to watch the videos that you produce. Encourage them to connect through a variety of different online ways to be able to strengthen the connections between family and institution and teachers. It could be possible that students don't know how to interact with their peers or how to conduct peer assessment. And so in this case, explicit instruction is needed. And that's also the case for higher education students and not just for those students in K-12. Co-creating resources with peers has been found particularly engaging at all levels. And as I mentioned, peer assessment has also been found to be a really engaging tool. Where institutions use technology and apps to connect with families and to connect with students, using push notifications has been found really engaging and really helpful. And it's important that there's a whole institution approach to digital strategy. It can't just necessarily be all down to a handful of educators or to one single faculty. It should really be a whole institution approach. And finally, we come to the student centered at the middle of that microsystem. It's important that students receive explicit guidance in how to use the tools that you're asking them to use. And it's also important that you provide them with some kind of induction period so that they've got some, like even if it's just a week or a couple of days, so that they can get used to the tools before they're asked to use them in more meaningful ways. It's also a good idea to scaffold routine in order to build time management and self-regulation skills. You know, students don't necessarily innately understand how to do that, especially when it's suddenly thrust upon them that they need to do this at home. And so scaffolding that kind of routine, that kind of time management for them is a really great way to lead them to more self-regulated learning. And finally, self-assessment. So offering students the opportunities to undertake ongoing reflection and self-assessment using rubrics. Provide them with a rubric for an assessment task and ask them how they think they performed. Or even before the assessment begins, ensure that you provide that rubric and have them aim for the top. There's no need to look at anything other than the top highest performing band in a rubric and aiming to ensure that their task is performing to those standards. Right, so that's basically the end of my presentation today. I know that it was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So if you would like to get in touch about any of the research that I've done with my colleagues, please don't hesitate to do so. My email at UniSA is on the screen. And I'm also on Twitter and ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and I'd love to get in touch with you as well. I'd love to connect with you. If you're interested in finding out more about the EpiReviewer synthesis software, we do have a YouTube channel, and you'd be more than welcome to contact the EpiReviewer support using the email on the screen. So all that's left to say is thank you so very much for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful start to the new year and that you stay safe and well. Thank you so much. See you later.
Muchas gracias nuevamente, Melissa, por compartirnos tus reflexiones. Nadie puede negar que hoy vivimos en un mundo que ya cambió, que es completamente híbrido.
Y esto llegó para quedarse.